As we start Unit 4, I want to start with just some discussions and ideas about how we might define notions of justice and how we can think about principles of fairness. So some focus questions in this unit can include, should all human beings have community-supported access to reasonable, life-sustaining health care? And we're going to need to define what those features of reasonable, life-sustaining health care look like. How do we define the goals and goods of healthcare and distribute them fairly and justly? We're going to see in our next lecture that there's a fair amount of ambiguity as we talk about the goals and the ability to cure disease. What professional ethical guidelines should nurses uphold in the political and social context of public health? So even in this unit, after we establish some ideas of a particular philosopher, I want to look at the ANA code as it relates to a lot of these political and social contexts. So briefly, before we get started, this may be an image others have seen before, but I think it's a helpful way to visualize the difference between equality and equity. In the first image, it is assumed that everyone will benefit from the same supports and they are treated equally. So you can see the size boxes are the same, but clearly that's not working for the little guy on the right. In the second image, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game, and they're being treated equitably. And this is really going to be the position that we'll look at a little bit more with John Rawls. In the third image, all three can see the game without any supports or accommodations because the cause of inequity was addressed. The systematic barrier has been removed. So clearly this is the ideal, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which greater access across the board to healthcare can be provided. But I think we recognize that if we were to apply this image to some of the complexity of healthcare for every American, we see that this can be quite difficult and challenging. So I want to take a little bit of time to look at a very influential philosopher in this regard named John Rawls. And in his book, A Theory of Justice, he lays out a particular approach to distributive justice that's had a big impact in a lot of social and political thought. And so what Rawls almost imagines is to say, if all social and economic goods were to be distributed with justice, he imagines almost, all social agents, in an analogous way, kind of entering a room and looking at social goods, including, income, education, healthcare. How would we distribute this evenly, recognizing that we have different abilities and we're on different stages of the social ladder? And one of the first things he says is that we need to distribute this with a veil of ignorance. In other words, each person, each rational, self-interested agent would not be aware of his or her own social standing as well as the social standing of others. Okay, so what this tries to do in his theory is eliminate any type of bias and kind of self-protected interest, whether that's in social class or religion or race or any of those things. He then goes on to say that we should distribute with two principles in mind. The first is that we're trying to grant equal rights and basic liberties for all agents. That makes a lot of sense, and we'll talk a little bit more about how he balances those rights. And second, inequalities are to be arranged so that the greatest benefit is to the least advantage. Again, trying to supply maybe a few extra blocks for those who are a bit shorter, right? And also that these social goods are attached to offices and positions that are open to all under conditions of equality and opportunity. So it's getting at this idea that we don't simply hand out these goods, but we recognize that we need to create avenues in which people can gain access and build them for themselves. And we're going to kind of see how this connects maybe a bit more later in this unit with healthcare. So we recognize that as we, in this analogous imagined scenario, if we exit the room, that inequalities exist. And as long as we are distributing them in such a way that we're benefiting the least well off in that society, then we have uh, the example, the ideal of equity, right, of an equal distribution. The example that he gives in his writings is taxation. You know, we do theoretically have higher tax brackets if you make more money and lower tax brackets if you don't, right? So that's one way that our government kind of sets up a way in which we're trying to get, we're treating people differently, but we're trying to get at this idea of equity. Individuals should have as much liberty as possible, as long as that liberty doesn't violate the rights of someone else. So an example that's sometimes given is that we have religious liberty to practice any way we want, but if that religious practice involved human sacrifice, then that's infringing upon, obviously, the right of someone else to exist, and that would be a problem. So again, we'll kind of see how the rights to healthcare might bump up against each other. And just coming back to this idea of the veil of ignorance, Rawls is going to argue that if we were really blind to concepts and indicators of social status, that will be what he calls risk adverse, right? Because we don't know where a person stands. We want to try to treat everybody with equity, right? Making sure that we can distribute as evenly as possible. So two applications to the Nursing Code of Ethics. I was looking at Provision 8, which really dictates this idea of health as a universal human right. And in condition number 2, nurses must address the context of health, including social detriments, such as poverty, access to clean water, air, goes on with a longer list. And secondly, nurses must address human rights, protection of vulnerable groups, the poor, the homeless, the elderly. So again, recognizing those disadvantaged groups that might need particular care. In Provision 9, this is extended to issues around social justice and global health. And there really is indicated a professional responsibility to address unjust systems and structures. And in 9.4, to engage in the political process, particularly in addressing legislative and regulatory concerns of public health and the profession of nursing. So again, I don't want to get involved in heated political debates here, but it does seem interesting that even within the Code of Ethics for Nursing, there is a very specific way in which issues of public health and access to health care is part of a professional ethic and responsibility. And so we'll take a look at just a few of those dimensions. The Affordable Health Care Act, sometimes called Obamacare, and some of the legislative aspects of this as well. But these are important ethical guidelines in this unit. So let's go on to talk a little bit more about goals of healthcare and some of these other dimensions.